Hello and welcome to Understanding Adventist Beliefs. If you want to know more about Seventh-day Adventists and what they believe, this is for you. I have invited theological experts to join us for a frank discussion about Adventist faith and practice. We will explore the biblical reasons why Adventists believe what they confess in their fundamental beliefs, and we invite you to reflect with us in greater depth the biblical meaning, beauty, and relevance of Adventist beliefs. My name is Frank Hasel. I'm your host, and today we will look more closely at fundamental belief number 20, the Sabbath. Today I have the pleasure of having Dr. Mathilde Frey and Keldie Paroshi as my conversation partners. Dr. Frey grew up in communist Romania, but has moved to West Germany and since has lived in Austria and worked in Germany, in the Philippines, and in the United States. She is a specialist in Old Testament theology and Hebrew language and currently teaches at Walla Walla University in Washington State in the beautiful Northwest. Dr. Frey has written her dissertation on the Sabbath in the Pentateuch, and we look forward to learn from her insights into our subject today. Keldie Paroshi is originally from Brazil, but has lived many years in Central Europe and currently is a PhD student in New Testament studies at Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. I was born and raised in Germany and currently work as an associate director of the Biblical Research Institute at the world headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Silver Spring, Maryland. Mathilde and Keldie, thank you for joining me in this conversation about the biblical teaching of the Sabbath and what it means for Seventh-day Adventists and for us today. Now, before we will enter into a discussion, I think it will be helpful just to read the actual words of that fundamental belief, number 20, so that we have a better understanding of what we are talking about. So here I quote, "The gracious Creator, after the 6 days of creation, rested on the seventh day and instituted the Sabbath for all people as a memorial of creation. The fourth commandment of God's unchanging law, requires the observance of this seventh-day Sabbath as a day of rest, worship, and ministry in harmony with the teaching and practice of Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day of delightful communion with God and one another. It is a symbol of our redemption in Christ, a sign of our sanctification, a token of our allegiance, and a foretaste of our eternal future in God's kingdom. The Sabbath is God's perpetual sign of His eternal covenant between Him and His people. Joyful observance of this holy time from evening to evening, sunset to sunset, is a celebration of God's creative and redemptive acts." That's the text of that particular fundamental belief. There is a lot included in there that needs to be explored and discussed, but I would like to start our discussion by raising a practical, simple, but important question to both of you, and that is, when we are talking about the Sabbath, can you explain to us, unfold that a little bit more? What is the beauty? What is the blessing? What is the significance of the Sabbath for us today? Any ideas that you would like to share on that particular question?
Well, Frank, thank you so much for this time, the invitation to be here with you. I am delighted to have a conversation together with you on the topic of Sabbath. For me personally, when I think of Sabbath and its blessing and beauty, I remember the time of my childhood. I grew up in a household where we kept Sabbath regularly, and we worshiped together with our church community. But this was also a place where Sabbath keeping was not welcome. It was not the freedom given to do that. So when I think of Sabbath, I remember those times where my world was almost shifting when it came, when the transition happened from the weekday time to what we consider Sabbath time, with the sunset on Friday evening. I went to school, and school was from Monday to Saturday, Sabbath. And so especially when I was young, I think it was in second grade, I went to school on Monday morning, and the teacher made me stop at the front door and all students were sitting in their places. And he waited until everybody was present, and then he would ask, "So where have you been on Saturday?" And as a little child, about 8 years old, I basically shivered looking at this elderly, tall man with such an authority and deep voice, and would just whisper and say, "I went to church with my parents." And that is when he became enraged, literally enraged, and would scream and would throw things through the classroom, even coming with his thin rod that he used for us back then. That is what was still done, and made me hold out my palms. And then he counted to 10 into each palm. And that is how my week started, on many, many times throughout that school year. But then the week passed, and we came to Friday, and I remember the smells and of good food in our house. My mother would prepare it, and I knew Sabbath was the climax of the week. Sabbath was the best that we received. And Sabbath started, and it was a different world. I met with my friends, and this was just the most beautiful time that I remember spending. We sat in church, we had our small groups, youth groups, and so on. We went out into nature and celebrated the day together with good food, with different kind of clothes than throughout the week. And so Sabbath became such a special day for me, and I will always remember that time. And so when I came to study and decided on a topic for my research, I wanted to know what was it that kept me through an entire week where I felt scared and so singled out, and yet Sabbath was present and kind of like almost like catapulted me into that different realm, the realm where the world was perfect and beautiful, and everything was like so wholesome in that. So that is how I approach Sabbath.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, thank you for sharing that personal insight into your childhood and how you experienced the Sabbath as a special time that was different from the normal time of the world, that was a beautiful time for you, that is associated with nice smells, good food, fellowship, perhaps even singing, and time with other people. So thank you. That's part of the beauty of the Sabbath. Any thoughts on your end, Keldie?
Yeah, I remember reading a book on the Sabbath. It's been many years ago, but it was by Abraham Heschel. He's a Jewish author, a Jewish philosopher, and he has this very small book on the Sabbath. And for me, that really encapsulates a lot of the beauty, the significance of the Sabbath, especially when he talks about how the Sabbath really is a time that is separated for us to meet with God. It's a special, it's an entire day, a special day that is separated for us to have that fellowship, to encounter God in a special way that is different from our daily routine, different from, like Mathilde was saying, different from our normal activities, our normal weekly activities, but it's a set apart day just for God, just for fellowship, just for thinking about who God is and what He has done for us. So it's really this concept of it's a special time of encounter. I think that for me, that's really what the beauty of the Sabbath begins there. Yeah.
So that's another interesting, important aspect. It's a special time of encounter between you and God, perhaps other people who also share the same faith and insights. Any other things that you would say from a biblical perspective, why is the Sabbath significant? Why is it significant for us today?
I love that book, Keldie, by Abraham Joshua Heschel. I recommend that to my students. He speaks of Sabbath as the sacredness, God's holiness in time, the temple in time. And it's so arresting to read through that with that deep insight that he provides there. In the biblical text, of course, we read the Sabbath on the first page, if you will, of the Bible. And it is the seventh day of the creation week, and God stops from all his work. That is the literal wording that is provided there with that Hebrew word for Shabbat. And so God stops from all his work. And if God, who has worked for 6 days, and at the end of every day, everything was always good, and then very good, and yet God stops. Even the goodness of creation stops, and God comes into this world. That is how I understand the text of the first Sabbath celebrated in the Bible. God enters into this world with his presence, the presence of holiness and the presence of blessing.
That's an important point to mention, Mathilde, the aspect of holiness, right? Holiness in the Bible really is connected to the presence of God. God is a holy God. He is separate. He is different from us. There is no sin in him, and so where God is present, that is holy ground. That is holy time. That is a holy place. And so when we're talking about the Sabbath, it really is a holy day because God is present in a special way, and just the fact that He wants to have an entire day that is set apart, that is holy, that is special to meet us, to have that fellowship with us. I find that really significant.
That's an interesting, important thought that you just mentioned, Keldie, the holiness. And actually, holiness in the Bible is not just about this absolute perfection and sinlessness, but it is a relational concept. And holiness, as you said, has to do with the presence of God, and He invites us into that presence, into that relationship with Him. And the Sabbath has echoes that holiness. And in that book that you both mentioned by Abraham Heschel on the Sabbath, really, he talks about the Sabbath as a temple in time. And the nice concept is that the Sabbath really comes to us. We don't have to travel to a sacred place and location to meet God, but God really comes to us no matter where we are on this earth. And every seventh day, the sacredness of that encounter with God, the opportunity of that meeting God on the Sabbath day comes to us and graces this world and our lives with fullness and happiness and blessings. Yes. Any additional thoughts, Mathilde?
Well, when we move out from the story of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and then come into the book of Exodus, that is, I believe, where the Sabbath comes to be developed in the biblical text. The first is the giving of the manna, the gift of food. And I like to connect that with even again with the creation text in Genesis 1, because even before God comes and offers Sabbath, he has offered food also already as a gift. Everything is food for you is the ending of the text when we learn about the creation of human beings. And so the gift of food is an important element connected to Sabbath. And I think to make Sabbath into a true pleasure is to pay attention to those things. Food is an important matter to God. It is important in the entire biblical text. I learned from a study that was done about food specifically that almost every page in the Bible has something to say about food. In some way, food is so important that it is all over the biblical text, and we should not ignore it.
Yes.
Or think of it as something that is just, a mundane thing that we as human beings need. It is so important that God offers it and gifts it to us in direct relation to Sabbath. And so the story of manna points that part out especially.
And it shows the blessing, right? That this is an abundant blessing that God gives, that he provides us, and that's really beautiful.
Yeah, and it shows he provides for our needs, physical needs, the food, also for our spiritual needs, and both are connected. And on every Friday, he would perform that manna miracle, as we read in Exodus there, chapter 16. Then more manna would fall than on the normal days, and then on Sabbath, there was rest, there was peace, there was shalom, really that harmony that God desired to have with humanity from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. Very interesting. So we have the Sabbath starting in Eden, basically, at the very beginning of humanity. Then we see it later on in the Pentateuch, in Exodus. And then you mentioned Exodus 20, of course, where he has the commandments, and the Sabbath is there again.
That is where the Sabbath takes its central place. It is at the heart of those 10 commandments. And it kind of like builds that transition from the part of the 10 commandments that are directly speaking to human relationship and God, and then comes Sabbath as the day of the Lord your God. And the Sabbath then includes human beings in the sense of family community. Everyone in that community is part of it. No one is excluded. Everyone is equally invited to stop from working and not do any work.
Even the animals are blessed by the Sabbath rest in the commandments. Yes. Keldie, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to point out one more thing about the creation. Sorry, going back a little bit here. But it's interesting that the Sabbath is actually the first day for human beings. It's the seventh day of the week, but really it is the first day where human beings, the first full day that they experience. And they weren't tired, they didn't work, but the first day in their existence is the special day that is separated for fellowship with God. So for me, that really highlights how spending time with God, having that fellowship with God, should be the foundation of our existence. That's how we should look forward to the next week, by beginning the time with this fellowship with God, and that's the starting point basically of who we are as human beings.
Now let's explore that just a little further. I like that idea. It's indeed, so the Sabbath starts basically in the first full day that they have Shabbat. They have rest. They have fellowship with God before they even start to work. Doesn't that teach us something important from a biblical perspective on the worth and relationship of what we produce with our hands, and about the rest and about what is important to God? Can you unfold that a little further? Because I think that's an important aspect of the beauty and the significance of the Sabbath that he can teach us.
So when I read the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20, verse 11, from verse 8 to 11, I like to put 3 questions into that passage. And my first question is, who is this God who offers Sabbath to people who have been enslaved for all their lives, for 400 years in Egypt, and have suffered under the heavy powers of the Egyptian pharaohs? So now God offers Sabbath to a people who has been freed or come out from slavery, and there is a time frame stated in chapter 19, at the very beginning of chapter 19, and that indicates that the Israelite people are out of Egypt for only 2 months. So only a few weeks, basically. And they arrive on Mount Sinai, and God offers this word and says, work 6 days, but do not do any work on the 7th day. That, to me, sounds like the best message ever.
So why is that? Why is that a good message? Why is that good news for you?
Well, if we are able to put ourselves into the shoes of people who have suffered for an entire lifetime, who have been beaten down and made to work without any freedom, without any free day to stop, to recuperate, to rest, and to enjoy that fellowship with God and with each other, then I cannot imagine a better message. And then God offers this as his day. It's God's day, and God now becomes this giver of freedom to people who have been enslaved.
So the Sabbath actually then would be a sign of grace, if I hear you correctly.
Of course. Yes, of course. A sign of grace, a gift of grace, the gift of freedom in itself. And God is the one who does that. So who is God? God is the one who gifts with the best possible to people in that specific situation where they needed it most. And God becomes this relational God for people, because he speaks of, I am the Lord, your God, and this is the day that is the Lord's day that is given to them.
Yes. And in Deuteronomy 5, actually, where the 10 Commandments are repeated, that aspect of deliverance from Egypt and the Sabbath to celebrate that freedom is even pointed out more specifically. So that's a very important connection that you point out, and it shows us something about God's character and the character of the Sabbath. It's a day of grace, it's a day of deliverance, it's a day to connect with that Creator God who has created us in the beginning, and it gives special meaning to that relationship.
That's an important point, because really it's easy to focus on what the Sabbath does for us in terms of we don't have to work, which is amazing, and gives us that freedom that we talked about. But it also says very important things about who God is. Like we mentioned in Exodus 20, it says, for God rested on the 7th day. So it points back to, this is God the Creator that we're talking about. It's not just any God, it's the God, the Creator of heavens and earth. Mathilde mentioned the manna story. This is the God who provides, who gives, who is gracious, and the connection to Exodus, like you said in Deuteronomy 5. This is the God who redeems, who saves, who is gracious to his people. So the Sabbath really says so much about who God is as his character, his holiness, and his saving activities, his creating and saving activities, all seeking this relationship with us.
And only as redeemed people, really, after they have experienced God's salvation out of slavery, does God give them basically the covenant words of the Ten Commandments. And I think that is so important for us to keep in mind as well, not just for the Sabbath, for all the commandments, but especially for the Sabbath. When we talk about it now, you cannot keep the commandments of God if you have not first experienced His grace in salvation. As a redeemed people, the commandments and the Sabbath in particular is never the way to salvation. It is always kept as a response to the salvation that God freely has provided in the first place. And so the Sabbath doesn't earn us salvation or the heaven at all, as all the other commandments do not do either. But they have to be celebrated and kept in the right perspective. And I think Sinai and the Exodus that came before Sinai reminds us of that fact. Any additional thoughts, Mathilde, that you want to share on that particular subject?
I think that is a very important point about how we understand the Ten Commandments in general, and then Sabbath in particular, as God's gift to people who are redeemed and delivered. And then they become that element of that basis of that new built relationship. And the relationship is built because God has intervened and God has acted and done the work of salvation, of redemption. So God, the Creator, now in the book of Exodus, is also God, the Redeemer. And Sabbath is that part that brings people together into that covenant relationship that we learn about, especially in this book. I wanted to add the other question to the one, who is this God? And my second question is, who are you, or who am I in that Sabbath commandment? And I love the way the fourth commandment in Exodus 20 is written, because it contains in the middle of it, it contains a list of people plus the animals. And you mentioned them before, Frank. They are part of Sabbath keeping. So we learn that there is an entire group of people part of it. And when we count the list, then we learn that this has the number 7. 7 are part of it, and we deal with the seventh day. And so that element makes, in the Hebrew context and in the Hebrew Bible, here in the book of Exodus, that makes Sabbath truly special. We speak of the most holy day. The number 7 conveys that meaning, the wholesomeness, the completeness of everything. And now this Sabbath comes into a world, and this world that is broken and suffers on all kinds of levels, and yet it puts our own lives in our communities into that context of God's wholeness. And so we have the 7 list of people, you and your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, and your sojourner, who is part of Sabbath commandment here. And so who are you? Who am I? Am I present in this list? Am I part of it? That is, to me, an important question to explore. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, that's interesting. It seems to me, from what you say and what the biblical text indicates there in the fourth commandment, that the Sabbath is really intended for everyone. And that the Sabbath is not just for a specific small group of people, but that everyone in our sphere, everyone who is human, and even the animals who are part of our responsibility should benefit from the blessing of the Sabbath. Now that leads me to a related question, and maybe we can pick up on that. You know, we often hear people say, yeah, the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is something Jewish. We are Christians, and therefore we don't keep the Jewish traditions and the Jewish days of feasts and celebration and so forth. Why should we keep the Sabbath as Christians if that is a Jewish institution? What would you say? That would limit the Sabbath to the Jews, to the Old Testament, basically. What would you say to that in response?
I think the way the Bible presents the Sabbath is actually much broader than limited to the people of Israel. The way the Sabbath is presented, like we talked about in creation and even in the New Testament when Jesus talks about it, it's really a gift for humankind. It's a day for everyone. You know, even in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, like we mentioned, there's a whole list of people here that we're not only talking about Jews, we're talking about even the foreigner within your house. So the Sabbath blessing really is a gift that God gives to all humankind. And I mean, which one of us would not want to have that kind of blessing, that kind of day of rest from everything else? You know, it just makes it much more meaningful that this is something that God wants everyone to experience, everyone to have that blessing in their lives.
Thank you. Mathilde.
Well, I think we should be truly thankful to the Jewish people who have kept the tradition of Sabbath keeping alive.
Thank you for pointing that out.
I think that is an immense gift to the world and has come into the Christian church because of that very careful and very consistent keeping of Sabbath as God's holy day. And I think Keldie has made a point that in the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20, and then that takes us back again to the creation text, that Sabbath is made available in God's word to all humanity, to all people, no matter where you are. To that, we could add, for example, the very fact that Sabbath is a matter of time and not place, again, makes it available to all world. We do not have to travel to a particular place to worship God. God is not reserved and makes himself available to a certain nation or people group. God is the great creator God in the text of Sabbath. And so that, again, opens up that particular understanding of Sabbath again. And even, for example, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who we mentioned and spoke about in the beginning, makes that approach for Sabbath to become that open world that God offers to all creation. And other Jewish thinkers like Martin Buber and so on have done that as well.
So the Sabbath really is a gift, God's gift to humanity, not just to a special people. And it's interesting that the Sabbath, even the Ten Commandments, the fourth commandment refers back to the very beginning, to creation. It makes that reference very clear. And in the beginning, humanity started. And even before the fall of of sin. You know, before sin entered this world, God had given the Sabbath as a memorial, as a sign that he wanted to have that fellowship with humanity that he created at the beginning. So in that sense, the Sabbath is for all. And the Sabbath is not limited to just a small group. Yes, absolutely. Now, if that is the case, then naturally the question comes, you know, if the Sabbath is intended for all, how come that only a few Christians today keep the Sabbath? The majority of Christians keeps a different day of the week, the Sunday, as the day of worship. So how did that come? What happened here that the Sabbath, who was intended from the beginning for all humanity, has lost that significance?
I think a place to start answering your question. There's very many different aspects to answer that, but a starting point would be to really look at how is the Sabbath presented in the New Testament, because one of the first arguments will say that the New Testament has done away with the Sabbath, but actually, and starting with Jesus, right? When we look at how Jesus approached the Sabbath in his ministry, we really see that it's a day that he kept. You know, it was his custom to go to the synagogue every week on Shabbat. And not only did he keep it in that way, but he healed several people on the Sabbath. There's different stories that we see about Jesus healing on the Sabbath, and that's really beautiful because it shows that Jesus values the importance of humanity on that special day. It's a special day of healing. It's a special day of rest, of physical, spiritual rest that Jesus extends to those who really need it on the Sabbath. So again, to begin answering your question, I think looking at Jesus's ministry and how he dealt with the Sabbath is a really nice place to start.
Any additional thoughts, Mathilde?
Well, I think it's also good to note how the early Christian church is of people who keep Sabbath, Jewish people who keep Sabbath traditionally as they have grown up with it. And Sabbath is not taken off or abolished or discarded with. But the New Testament, for example, in the book of Acts, gives us insights into how that small group of house churches, how they would come together and celebrate on the day of God. And then the several other passages in the New Testament make that point as well. Of course, there are debates happening among biblical interpreters on certain passages on those, but I don't think that anybody in the Christian world negates the fact that the foundation of the Christian church is built by Jewish believers in Christ, the Messiah, and that they have built this community, this new community of following Jesus, with the gift of Sabbath keeping included in that. And it is only a couple hundred years later that Sunday keeping becomes an institutionalized day as worship day for the Christian church.
So actually the Sabbath then, if I hear you correctly, was continued to be kept by the New Testament church, by the believers. And in fact, we have historical evidence for that for many years, many hundreds of years, people would continue to keep the Sabbath and at times parallel keeping the Sabbath and the Sunday side by side. And then over time, Sunday worship became more dominant, especially through the circumstances that Christianity became the recognized state church of the Roman Empire. And that helped among many other factors, to give prominence to Sunday worship. But in many parts of the world, Sabbath worship continued for many centuries, even to the present time.
And let me just point one more thing out. When we're talking about the theological significance of the Sabbath, that is also something that we find being continued in the New Testament. You know, we talked about here the Sabbath as a memorial of creation, as a day to remember God's saving acts for His people. And all of those things continue into the New Testament as well. I mean, that is where we find Jesus dying for us in order to save us. And so that redemption significance of the Sabbath and who God is as creator, all of those theological themes continue within the New Testament as well. So theologically, it is understandable that, the significance of the Sabbath on the seventh day does not change in that aspect.
And you mentioned that Jesus himself performed many healing miracles, especially on the Sabbath day. And I think he did this on purpose, not to violate the Sabbath, but to restore the original meaning of the shalom, of the harmony, of the well-being that God had intended from the beginning in the Garden of Eden. So he, as the Messiah, wants to restore that in his ministry, starting his kingdom on earth. Yes, any other thoughts that you would like to throw in here and in our discussion? Feel free to let us know.
I love that there is one small text. I need to go back to the Old Testament. I'm sorry.
Sure.
That is my area. So I love another very small passage about Sabbath keeping, and that is just a couple chapters beyond the commandment in Exodus, and this is chapter 23, verse 12. And when you read that in our English Bibles, it sounds kind of like close to the fourth commandment in Exodus 20, and also the one that is in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5. So there are connections to those two places. But there is something that makes it special. And here is the text. It's just one verse. 6 days you are to do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease. And that is where we, for the first time after the creation story, have the verb Shabbat again. Cease, stop. You shall stop, cease from all your work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest. So here is the emphasis first on the animals. And it makes it clear, the ox and the donkey. And again, if we read that closely and contextually, then these are animals that are used in a farming environment, out there, hard-working animals that plow the fields or carry heavy burdens. And they are to be given that stopping, that pause from all your work in the first place. So that's one element that makes this text stand out from the others that I mentioned. And then comes another part in it. It says, and the son of your female slave. Now remember, in the fourth commandment in chapter 20 and in Deuteronomy, we have the female slave and the male slave mentioned in that list of the group of 7. But now here, it's only the female slave, and she has a child, she has a son. So we have not learned about this in the other texts in the commandments. This is the mother with a child, with a son. And when you do a deeper analysis on that expression, the son of the female slave, it is not used many times in the Bible, and definitely not used in other places in the Pentateuch or in the Torah, but only in one other story. And that story, I'm sure you captured it already by the wording, the son of the female slave. It's the story of Hagar and her son Ishmael. And she's out there in the desert, and the son is about to die, and the mother cries out to God, and God comes and brings him back basically to life with gift of water and food and so on. And so that is the background story, I would say, to this very small passage here. And when we again then look into that story a little closer, we clearly learn that, for example, Hagar is the slave woman that was taken from Egypt. And the context of this text in Exodus 23 is stated several times, just a few verses above. Do not oppress the person who is a stranger or a widow or an orphan, because you know the feelings of those people, you know the life, the nefesh of those people, because you were in Egypt. And so make sure, says God in the Sabbath text, that you offer that freedom even to the person who is an Egyptian.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for that insight. You know, as I was listening to you, Mathilde, it occurred to me, if you take these biblical statements seriously on the Sabbath, and we have not even explored all the other beautiful statements that we find on the Sabbath, but it occurs to me that the Sabbath really teaches us that we are stewards, God's stewards, and that all those who come in the sphere of influence of our lives, for which we are responsible, be that the animals, be that the people who work for us, you know, for which we are responsible, they should also receive the blessing of that day of rest, and they should also enjoy the refreshment that comes from that day that God has instituted for everyone. And in that sense, really, you know, mentioning the female slave and the male slave and even the son of the female slave, you know, it really teaches me that the Sabbath fosters equality, if I may say that, you know. And if we think about it, it really is a beautiful concept, because if everyone rests on the Sabbath, then there is no difference if you are employer or employee. It doesn't make a difference if you are the boss or the servant. Everyone is equal before God, and even the animals should receive a special blessing from that.
Can I add here, Isaiah 56 has a beautiful passage on the Sabbath that I really like, and fits very well here with this context that we're talking about. You know, within the context of Israel, there were several people who would have been considered excluded from the covenant, excluded from the people of Israel. We already talked about like foreigners, such as Hagar, and eunuchs was another class of people that would have traditionally been excluded from the people, but here in Isaiah 56, in verses 4 through 8, really, God makes this promise to eunuchs and to foreigners. I'll read just verse 6 here. As for foreigners who become followers of the Lord and serve Him, who love the name of the Lord and want to be His servants, all who observe the Sabbath and do not defile it, and who are faithful to my covenant, and then verse 7, I will bring them to my holy mountain. I will make them happy in the temple where people pray to me. So this is a really shows how the blessing of the Sabbath is extended to all. It's a blessing that God offers to everyone, even those who traditionally would have been considered excluded. But all of them are invited to keep the Sabbath and to experience that special covenant relationship with with God, that He extends to them, that He extends to everyone. So for me, that really shows, just really, again, like we were talking about, how the Sabbath is for all humankind. It's a blessing for everyone. It's the great equalizer, right? Where everyone who traditionally would have been excluded are included in the blessings of God.
Beautiful, yes. And as such, really, the Sabbath becomes a sign of belonging. Belonging to that Creator God, belonging to that Redeemer God, that God who ushers in, really, a kingdom where that is upside down, where everyone is equal, and we can live as His children. That's beautiful. Now, our time is almost up. We have not even touched on many New Testament statements on the Sabbath and its significance for us even at the end of time. Any final thoughts that you would like to share with us on why you think the Sabbath is significant for us and why the Sabbath should be kept, that you would like to have as a concluding thought, maybe, that you would like to share?
The prophets, and we spoke of Isaiah here in the first place, but there is also Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah's message about Sabbath, Sabbath has become this institutionalized days together with temple worship. And Jeremiah makes the point and says, it is of no meaning if you do all of that, offer sacrifices, go to the temple, worship, or also keep Sabbath, if it is not with that attitude of from the heart. And that is Jeremiah's particular message about that, to keep all of these commandments and the day holy with that understanding that this is God's gift to us as human beings and as redeemed human beings, and then to make that available to all others. So in Jeremiah's time, when people come into the city and sell their goods and do their market and business things, then the prophet will speak against that and tries to make them understand again that religion is something that is not to be done in a manner that you follow laws and commandments just to fulfill a law, but this is a way of life. This is a relationship that is expressed in the relation to God and in relation to each other as human beings. And that is where Sabbath then should have its place in the Old and in the New Testament. And I think that is what Jesus was all about. For example, when he made that very clear statement, the Sabbath is made for the human being and not the human being for Sabbath. I love that statement.
Yes.
You could put it anywhere into the Bible, I believe.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that idea that it's a way of life. I like that. Keldie, do you want to share a final thought from your end?
Yeah, again, just going back to Isaiah, because there's really beautiful passages here about the Sabbath in Isaiah, this time in chapter 58, verses 13 and 14. I really like what it says here because it really presents the Sabbath as a blessing. It says, if you observe the Sabbath and keep from doing anything you please on my holy day, if you look forward to the Sabbath, treat the Lord's holy day with respect, refraining from your normal activities, from your selfish pursuits, from making business deals, then you will find joy in your relationship to the Lord. I find that, I mean, what greater joy is there than to find joy, to find happiness, to find fulfillment in our relationship with God? And that really is what the Sabbath is all about. So for me, that blessing, that joy that is the Sabbath is really beautiful. And it goes back to what Mathilde was saying in the beginning about, all these memories that we have about what does does it mean to keep Sabbath, how it is a special day of joy, of relationships, of good food, you know, that's the blessing that God wants us to have. That's the joy that he wants us to experience on his special day.
Yeah, that's beautiful. As I think about the Sabbath, and this may be a final thought here in our discussion, I would fully concur with what you've said. And if you really understand the Sabbath that way, I like what you said, Mathilde, it's a way of life. And it's not just about keeping one particular day. Yes, that is important. But actually, it structures the entire week to keep that day holy. It requires that the values I have, the things that are really important, that count in my life, are expressed during the week in such a way that the Sabbath can stand apart, can receive the attention, and can give the blessing that it intended to have for us. And so for me, really, the Sabbath provides a margin in time. I think that we as human beings need so desperately. I mean, we live, especially in the Western world, in a very hurried way. You know, we are constantly pressured to produce and to produce and to produce and to perform and to perform. And our worth and our dignity is coupled to how much we produce and how we perform. And the Sabbath really creates a counterculture to that mentality and to that mindset. It shows that, no, the most important thing is not what I produce. The most important thing is who I am and what God has given to me already. And so it reminds me of my origin, the dignity and the worth that God has given all humanity at the beginning. And that permeates through the Sabbath His grace and His generosity. To give us that space and that freedom to breathe, really, and to remember who we are. And it dismantles all consumerism, that mentality that is so all-pervasive in our society. It gives us a moment of unhurried time. Yeah. I like that, you know, where you relax, where you breathe, where you recharge your spiritual batteries in the fellowship of other human beings, and especially with God, as you keep that day a special day, a holy day. And I think in that sense, the Sabbath really provides identity. And perhaps, as some people say, it's not so much that we keep the Sabbath, but really that the Sabbath keeps us. Yeah. And that's what I experienced, that the Sabbath is a blessing. It provides identity, and it keeps us as His people in a special way. Well, we could talk much more, but thank you for these insights. Thank you for sharing from your personal experience of the Sabbath. And I should say, if you've never experienced keeping the Sabbath, if the Sabbath is new to you, I invite you to join an Adventist church on a Sabbath morning for church worship service. Or even if you have some Adventist neighbors, join them on a Friday evening, because the Sabbath really starts on Friday evening. It starts before you start working. It starts with rest, the rest of night. And that's another blessing of the Sabbath that we haven't even talked about. So if you want to experience that, study the Bible, find out what the Bible really teaches about the Sabbath and the beauty of the Sabbath and the blessing of the Sabbath, and find other people who share that same conviction and insight from Scripture. And may God richly, richly bless you. I hope we'll see you again for other interesting series and discussions on other fundamental beliefs from Scripture that Seventh-day Adventists believe. And may God bless you as you search and live whatever you have discovered.